Hi, everybody. So, my name's Adil Wally. Apparently, I was late, so it is what it is. I've been called out, so I've lost all my credibility. No, it's totally cool. So I'm going to talk about premature commitment bias and other stuff. I have like 10 minutes, so I'm just going to dive in because I don't want to go over. So, in terms of my background, anything I've done that's like moderately successful is sort of not relevant. So I'm not going to talk about it. What you need to know is that I've started 9 companies, of which most have failed. 3 are still around, and I'm proud of that. I'm proud that like 3 are around. So that's my quick story. That's all I need to know. My story, compared to some of the people who are talking today, is totally unremarkable. So I'm not going to talk a lot about my story. I'm going to talk more about some of the stuff I've learned. And chief among them is this thing that I've been calling premature commitment bias. So premature commitment bias to me is the systematic drive for entrepreneurs to prematurely commit to spaces, ideas, or opportunities. And I think that is probably resonates with most folks. You've probably seen it or you've done it. I know I have. I think what's really interesting though is why. So why do people prematurely commit to ideas or spaces? And I think fundamentally what drives that is that we're incentivized to. The market, and I don't mean the market that you're targeting with your product or with your sort of service, but the meta market, the ecosystem, is actually incentivizing us to prematurely commit, right? Particularly here in the Valley, it's like the incentives are all there. In fact, we're rewarded to prematurely commit here in the Valley. So it's this interesting thing. So let's look at it sort of in real life, how it works in practice. The first thing you start with in your business is a story, right? Everything is built on the story. You need the story because you can't get any money without the story, and you can't get your team without the money, right? So, and we as humans, of course, have this narrative bias. When we see something we don't understand, we make up a story just to sort of figure out or rationalize what that thing is, right? So story is critical. So we get the team, and of course what we're going to do is we're going to work on product, and we're going to try to get it out there in the marketplace. And then our hope is that we're going to get traction. But the reality for most of us, of course, is that we're not ever going to get there. So this is where sort of some personal story can come into play. So I was in business school a couple years back, and there was this funny thing about story. There was this whole ecosystem of competitions built around telling a story. They're called business plan competitions. And in B school, how many people here have been to business school? Anybody? So okay, so some people have seen this. So there's this business plan competition circuit that you can run in business school, and it has nothing to do with reality. There's no grounding in reality in these things. It's all about, okay, can I tell a really good story? So I'm a kid, I'm in business school, so I think it makes sense to do that. So I do. I try to make up the coolest story I can. Of course, me as a person, I'm not fundable as a single entity, right? So I had to come up with some combination of me plus story that I thought was fundable as a kid in business school. So I did it, and it was really interesting. We got there, and I'll sort of come back to how it all happened, but we got there with this story, we got money, but the thing is, there was no grounding in reality for what we were doing. So yes, you can get the team. Is this possible? So yes, you can get the team, and I think that if you build the right product, yes, you'll get traction, but you have to understand that that's totally not the rule, that's the exception. So the problem with premature commitment bias here is you're starting with this story real early, and the reason that doesn't work is that when things don't go your way, which they often don't, we have this sort of bias to go down with the ship, right? This is what we do, because there's overhead created with the story. Right? You've got money in the bank, that's a form of overhead. You've got employees that you've sold on this story, right? Some of them might have joined your company because they were excited about the problem you were solving. So you have this sort of incentive to go down with the ship. You don't see the writing on the walls when you first get started. So the way that manifests itself is plan B, right? You say, okay, plan A isn't working, let's move on to plan B. Well, guess what? Plan B has the same chance of success that plan A did. Likely, it's not going to go anywhere. So by the time you're thinking about plan C, you start to consider a fire sale just because you want to keep your employees employed, right? At this point, that's all you're hanging on for. And for most of us, that's not going to happen. So the reality is we have to wind down the business. And for anybody in the room that's actually had to do that, how many people have had to lay people off or like close an office or anything like that? It is remarkably painful. So like this is the way the story pans out. And I think that the problem with the picture has everything to do with what entrepreneurship is, which is a learning experience. Like all it is sort of a learning curve. Like what VCs don't realize is that they're in the student loan business, right? Like no, seriously, like, they're paying us to learn. And like I've made more mistakes now than I did in college, and trust me, like college was crazy. And so like the point here is that at time zero, when we know as little as we're gonna know, like you see where it's like right there at zero, like that's when we're expected to have the best possible story. Right? So like that's what's wrong with the picture when you think about premature commitment bias. So the real issue with like why this is costly, why it's painful, has everything to do with time. And this is probably the most important thing I'm going to say. Like money is overrated. So like you have to understand that. The people who are giving you money, the people whose money you're spending, they know what they're doing. Like trust me on that. Right? Like if they're going to invest in 100 businesses, they know that 3 are going to pay for the 97 that fail. Right? Like that's called portfolio theory. You don't have it as an entrepreneur. Right? All your eggs are in one basket. That's the way the game works. And so time is the most valuable resource we have. A, because it's non-renewable. We can't make any more. I can make more money anytime I want. And B, because we can't even check our balance. I know how much money I have in the bank. I don't know how much time I have left. Right? So the reality here is like, if you spend 2 years doing something that's not interesting, guess what? You can't get that time back, and you're not going to be able to have done something interesting in that same block of time. So I think this is what makes premature commitment bias so painful. Unfortunately, so I wish I had sort of like a good story, like a good sort of, some good news, right? But the problem is like on the other side of the coin, there's this thing called never committing, which also sucks, and perhaps sucks worse than prematurely committing. Because the thing about entrepreneurship, as I think everybody here in the audience knows, and people are going to talk more about this, is it's sort of insane. It's totally irrational. And so to a certain degree, you have to look up sort of like at the cliff face and think to yourself, I'm going to climb this thing, right? Like you sort of have to do that. And that comes from commitment. If you never commit, you never do that, right? You never sort of have what it takes to get over like the crazy sort of set of obstacles you have in front of you. So never committing is particularly bad, and I think the real core point here is that like there's something powerful to be said about having no fucking choice, right? Like that's important. Like every business has that part, like that part of the story where you have no choice but to sort of go forward, right? So I think that's the problem with never committing. So then the sweet spot is about balancing sort of premature commitment and never committing, right? So where you want to be is somewhere in the middle. And look, I'm not going to sit here and say this is easy, right? This is sort of like the impossibly hard thing to do, right? But I guess that's what we're all chasing sort of in the end. And it's particularly hard because emotion is what's sort of swinging the pendulum for us as entrepreneurs, right? Like emotion is what gives us this sort of insane drive to do what we do. And so here's the thing. If you prematurely commit, chances are the pendulum will swing back the other way, which is why, by the way, so many people right now are trying to start incubators, right? Like they're going from like, hey, I prematurely committed, didn't work, now I want to do the rational thing, which is to do like 5 things at the same time. And and you know, I'm not going to comment on how rational that is or isn't, but that's what we do. And so the problem here is like you have to manage the ups and downs emotionally of what you're doing so that you're not making decisions at the peak and you're not making decisions in the valley, right? And I think that's the secret to sort of finding that sweet spot. So I guess what I'm saying is you want to sort of right-size your failure, right? Like if you're prematurely committing, then your failure is going to be epic, right? Like you're going to bundle all this risk into what you're doing. You're going to commit way too early. You're going to have these epic fall on your face sort of failures. And then if you're never committing, then you have these kind of like minuscule non-failing events where you don't learn anything, right? So like I think the secret to the sweet spot is finding sort of that like the right size of failure, which is sort of what we're all trying to do. Now I wish I had the secret to sort of how to do that. Unfortunately, I don't, but I have a working hypothesis, and I think I'll just share that. You need to sort of combine 3 things to make this work as far as I'm concerned. The first is a healthy sense of skepticism, and this is important for founders and your early team. I think you need to create incentives to sort of unearth failure with your early team, right? So like what you want to do is you want to actually incentivize the team to tell you that it's not working. And so this is sort of like up to your first 10 people, you want that sense of skepticism. And then I think the other thing you need to do, which more than enough people have talked about, and I'm sure everybody's read about, is sort of keeping things agile, right? Having a low cost of change. Another way to write this is a low cost of commitment, right? So that's really what you're trying to do when you keep things agile, and you want to be able to sort of make changes quickly, and you want to iterate. So I think that's the second pillar. And the third, and perhaps the most important thing, is you have to marry the problem. This is the single biggest problem in entrepreneurship that I see, is that entrepreneurs aren't married to problems. They're either A, married to solutions, which is the wrong thing to do, right? Because if you're married to the solution, you're almost certain to get hosed later, because your first solution is almost certainly not the right solution. And we talked earlier about time being the most important thing. So like, if you're married to the problem, then that's the most significant way you can curb your risk, because at least, even if you go on to fail, you'll have done something that you thought was meaningful, and you won't have wasted the time, right? So that's sort of the core. And I guess ultimately what I'm saying with the 3 pillars here is the journey of creating a business is about finding the right story. So don't delude yourselves or the people around you by pretending like you have the right story on day one, because you don't.